You own a phone, computer, or maybe even some Bitcoin? If that's the case, then there's one company you have in your hands every single day hiding in plain sight. Their innovation that powers your favorite devices, apps, and even your country's nuclear weapons turned $40,000 into a $3 trillion company, which at one point was worth more than Facebook and Amazon combined. But the company's only ever CEO started out life as a simple immigrant and waiter at a local Denny's restaurant. And while he's admired by many, holding historically high approval ratings compared to CEO peers like Elon, Zuck, and Bezos, to some people, there's a much darker side to his company, one filled with market manipulation, fraud, and even shady backdoor deals that deliberately weaken the US's power.
Nvidia just absolutely dominating.
That Nvidia is behaving monopolistic.
Nvidia is now the most important company on the planet.
This is the inspirational and sometimes dark story of Jensen Huang and his company, Nvidia, the man who secretly controls all of tech. From the day Jensen Huang was born in 1963, life started putting obstacles right in his way. Coming from a modest family in Taiwan made up of his father, a chemical engineer, and his mother, a school teacher, Jensen was constantly on the move during his early childhood. And after a number of these smaller moves around his country, Jensen's father decided to uproot their lives, moving the family to Bangkok, Thailand, in pursuit of better job opportunities when Jensen was just 4 years old. Parents were hopeful that this fresh start in a new country would really change their lives for the better. But instead, they only found more hardship and pain in this foreign land. The Huang family struggled to integrate with the Thai community in Bangkok. Before, they were well respected and well liked by their neighbors and colleagues in Taiwan. But now, instead, they found themselves shunned and alienated. And Jensen was no exception to this treatment. He didn't make friends at school or in the neighborhood, but he did maintain good grades because his mother gave Jensen the most valuable thing she had as a teacher, a great education. And despite not speaking a word of English herself, she made Jensen and his brother learn 10 different English words every single day because she was preparing to open them up to a whole new world in the future. And that future came much sooner than expected. In 1973, after years of anti-government protests, Thailand fell into chaos, with the military violently suppressing all rebels. Jensen was just 9 years old, but he understood what was happening. He watched in horror as tanks rolled past their house and bullets were sprayed everywhere.
In 1973, I think I was 9 years old, my older brother was 10. There was an upheaval. Military was tanks and soldiers were marching down the middle of the street. People were shooting each other.
To keep Jensen and his siblings safe, his parents decided to move one final time.
Theirs is the spirit that built America.
Huang Fengtin, the patriarch of the family, had been offered a job in the United States at an air conditioning company. Finally, this was their way to safety. But there was one catch. They couldn't all travel together. And at the age of 9 years old, it would be Jensen along with his brother who made the first big trip. Almost 9,000 miles away, where they were welcomed by an uncle in Tacoma, Washington. But shortly after their arrival in the US, Jensen and his brother were shipped off yet again, this time to a boarding school in Kentucky named Oneida Baptist Institute that his uncle discovered in a magazine ad. Jensen's uncle believed that this institute was an elite private school that would fast-track the children to achieve their parents' dreams of going to a prestigious American college. But he was wrong. The Oneida Baptist Institute wasn't a typical school. And instead of sending Jensen to a place that could help him fulfill his goals of getting an amazing American education, they sent him to a place that's only found in a child's worst nightmares. When Jensen first arrived at Oneida Baptist Institute, he looked around in shock. There were cigarette butts littered throughout the school, covering the ground, and all of the students were smoking. He quickly figured out that this wasn't some elite prep school at all. A 10-year-old Jensen tried his hardest not to judge his new home too harshly. But when he was shown to his room, he shockingly discovered that his 17-year-old roommate had just returned from the hospital.
Turns out my roommate was 17 years old, getting ready for bed. I noticed that He had all these fresh wounds, and he had just come from the hospital. He was in a fight. He had 7 stab wounds, and the other kid was killed. And so he was my roommate, and so that was kind of the beginning of my American experience.
Because Wonita Baptist wasn't a prestigious school. It wasn't even an average school. Instead, Jensen and his brother found themselves in a dangerous religious reform facility for some of the worst kids in the state. And all of a sudden, he was surrounded by violence, knife fights, brawls, smoking, and drugs as his new normal. But this was Jensen's new home now, his first experience in America, which was especially shocking to him since he wasn't a bad kid at all. In fact, Jensen was a straight-A student that didn't belong in this terrifying facility. And to make matters worse, there weren't many outsiders in 1970s Kentucky, let alone Taiwanese-born immigrants. So Jensen's accent, small figure, and foreign appearance made him an easy target for bullying. His days were filled with racial abuse, being mocked, and even beaten. And to add insult to all this injury, Jensen was singled out by the staff to do the dirtiest job in the entire institute, cleaning the bathrooms. Yet Jensen didn't give up or lose hope. He took pride in cleaning the bathrooms, transforming them from a disgusting mess into an immaculate cleanliness.
I never felt that I got the easy job, because what they left behind was, you can't unsee that kind of stuff. But that was my job.
And even with all that hardship, he still looked for the small moral victories. He was grateful that he could sit on the ledge of his room window and reach out to a tree to grab an apple. Jensen had never eaten apples before in Thailand, let alone been able to grab one whenever he wanted. This, he thought, was a luxury he never had before. Over time, his positivity rubbed off on the others around him. His bullies slowly softened on him too. He taught his knife-fighting roommate how to read, and in return, Jensen learned how to work out. Soon, he was doing bench press and push-ups every day. By the time his parents had arrived to visit, he was 11 years old and much stronger, both mentally and physically. But despite the fact that he was maturing well, his parents were horrified to learn of the conditions at Wonita. This wasn't the elite institution that they had expected for their boys. So Jensen and his brother were yanked out of school yet again and taken to Portland, Oregon, where after years of moving around, the Huang family finally found its long-term home. And at the local Aloha High School, his sparks of intellectual genius really began to shine. He cruised through school with top marks, skipping 2 grades, and at the age of 15, found his first paid job at a local Denny's restaurant, where Jensen worked as a dishwasher, busboy, and even waited a few tables when the primary waitstaff called in sick. For most teenagers, this wouldn't be a big deal, just a way to earn some pocket money while they were getting their education. But just like in every other aspect of his life, Jensen took this role seriously.
I was a good dishwasher. I was probably Denny's best dishwasher. I planned my work. I was organized. I was mise en place. And then I washed the living daylights out of the dishes. And then they promoted me to busboy. I was certain I'm the best busboy Denny's ever had.
In another life, Jensen would have risen through the ranks to lead this company. But the academic world was calling him. So at 16 years old, Jensen was admitted to Oregon State University, where he chose to study electrical engineering and became obsessed with how to build things. There, he met his future wife, Lori Mills, one of just 3 women in his engineering class. And even as a young man, Jensen was not afraid to go after what he wanted.
And I was the youngest kid in class. I was tiny, I was skinny, but I had a great pickup line.
What was the pickup line?
My strength was I was good in school, and I asked her if she wanted to see my homework. You want to see my homework? The ultimate pickup line, yeah.
And something about this shy, introverted Jensen impressed her, with the two hitting it off right away, becoming lab partners, study partners, and then life partners. By 1984, a freshly graduated Jensen was ready to apply his knowledge to the technology industry. He'd earned himself a job working at a world-class semiconductor company, Advanced Micro Devices, or AMD for short.
And my second job was AMD, and I loved AMD. When I was there, I worked there for 2 years. I loved it.
Jensen didn't know it at the time. But AMD was destined to become one of his biggest rivals, dragging him into million-dollar lawsuits as they fought for a trillion-dollar industry. Jensen's first task at AMD was to help design the microprocessor chips that would be used in IBM computers. These microprocessors, otherwise known as the brain inside of every computer, looked like tiny circuit-wired cities where every millimeter of space counted. Their ultimate goal was efficiency, and Jensen was a master architect. So just like every other job he had, Jensen was unwavering in his discipline. He went above and beyond to push AMD's technology to the limit, and his work ethic didn't go unnoticed. Jensen was soon recruited by LSI Logic, a rapidly growing semiconductor company where he worked as an application engineer, helping to extract every ounce of power out of each chip. But Jensen was always looking for the next challenge. While working full-time, he attended night classes at the prestigious Stanford University, eventually earning a master's degree there. With an elite degree and a job at an exciting tech company, Jensen had made it further than his parents ever could have imagined. Then came a surprising turn. In December 1992, two of Jensen's colleagues from Sun Microsystems, Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem, approached Jensen with a shocking offer.
And two of my good friends, Chris and Curtis, wanted to start a company. And they reached out to me to join them and to be part of it. And that was really the beginning.
They explained to Jensen that they were going to build their own graphics chip company, and they wanted him to help lead this new and exciting startup project. But initially, Jensen was reluctant. He knew how risky these startup companies could be. And by that point, Jensen had more than himself to think about too. He was now married to Lori with 2 kids and a dog waiting for him at home every night. And on top of that, he would be potentially throwing away all of the sacrifices his parents made to get him and his brother to America. So why would he put all of them at risk to pursue some silly dream of running his own tech company? Even with all of those factors telling him not to pursue this opportunity, Jensen was still intrigued. So he decided to meet with Chris and Curtis one night at a humble Denny's restaurant in San Jose, California, similar to the one that he worked at while in high school, so he could hear them out.
It just happened that I had 2 great friends who really wanted me to join their company, and they kept prodding me to join their company, and eventually one of us had to figure out how to go make it happen.
The 3 engineers talked over their ideas for hours, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee well into the night. It would be one of many late night meetings at this very Denny's to try and convince Jensen to join the project. But as the 3 men talked more, Jensen got more and more excited. That instinct to push boundaries and discover something new was lighting up inside him. And during all of these meetings, the broad strokes of a master plan for a new product began to form. They were all working at the cutting edge of the computer industry and knew it inside and out, including what was missing. They could see that the personal computer revolution was going to blow up in popularity, and that the advanced microprocessors inside of each one of these devices was about to become the hottest commodity in all of tech. So what if they created a multimedia chip for all these new PCs popping up on the market? One that could play games and watch movies with the level of visual effects from recent blockbuster movies like The Terminator and Jurassic Park. On the surface, their idea would be simple: to create a computer that solves problems that other computers couldn't. But because the industry didn't see the opportunity like Jensen did, they would need to design all of the hardware and software for these advanced processing chips themselves. Then they would be able to outsource the production to a factory somewhere else. Curtis would be in charge of the chip design, and they wanted Jensen to lead the entire company. But would he accept? Even after countless meetings, his rational brain kept telling him to say no. But at that moment, Jensen made a staggering decision. He turned his back on a safe career path and agreed to lead this new project, quitting his job and cashing out $150,000 in stock options, which drained his savings. That money was meant for 2 things: taking care of his family and getting this new business started. Jensen was filled with excitement and passion to be involved in the engineering of the future. But there was one huge glaring problem, one that Jensen hadn't even considered before going all in. He had no idea what he was doing. Jensen had never studied business, marketing, or communications before, and it showed. In an age well before social media provided small businesses with tips and advice, he was all alone in a new world of entrepreneurship. And sometimes he questioned, was he really the right man for the job? Jensen's first official day of work at Nvidia was on his 30th birthday. From then on, he met every day with his two co-founders working out of Curtis's condo in Fremont, California, ready to take over the world. Only, there wasn't much for them to do. In the early days of what would eventually become Nvidia, things were painfully slow. The three co-founders initially decided on a name for their startup, Primal Computer, and it was a mess. They didn't have any money yet, a clear vision, or any employees other than the three of them. Sometimes, the biggest decision they would need to make during the day was where to go for lunch and what to stock the fridge with. This phase lasted months. Jensen didn't have any knowledge about even the basics of business. But there was one big thing on his to-do list though, to incorporate his company. So he read up on how to do this and went to a nearby law firm so that he could get help with getting the process started. But that's where he ran into his first major obstacle. His lawyers told Jensen that he needed money to price the new company's shares. So Jensen gave them everything he had in his pockets, which amounted to about $200. But it was enough to officially buy 20% of his new company, and in total, the three men pulled together $40,000 to get the ball rolling. As for the name, Jensen wanted something that conveyed innovation, advancement, and futuristic technology. As they worked on coming up with a new name, the three men realized that they had been saving all of their project files and updates with the name NV. This led them to wonder, what if they could turn that inside joke into a real name? So they started looking through dictionaries for words that started with NV and quickly realized there weren't many, at least not in English. But then they found it. The word for envy in Latin was Nvidia. And that was it. They had it. Their new name was a statement. Something for the tech industry to watch out for. The team also had a logo mocked up as well. An all-seeing eye looking into the future. And what color did they choose? Green, representing the feelings of growth and freedom. But more importantly, it was a message to the other competitors that they would soon be green with envy. So in April 1993, Nvidia was officially born. But a new slick name and branding didn't help the fact that none of the three engineers had put together a business plan. Luckily, Jensen soon found out that venture capitalists were in the business of investing in people and not in plans. Instead, they realized they needed three things: a good reputation, passion, and trust. Jensen had already worked closely under famed electrical engineer Andy Bechtolsheim, the founder of Sun Microsystems and a titan in the computer industry. That earned him a great reputation as a chip designer. And Jensen's passion was clear to anyone who met him. The last step was going to be building trust with the right people. So Jensen went to pull on the only string he had and got in touch with his former boss from LSI Logic, Wilfred Corrigan, another world-famous engineer in the tech industry. And Corrigan was more than happy to help one of his favorite employees. So when Jensen showed up at his office one day looking for guidance, Wilfred picked up the phone and made a call. The only call Jensen would ever need to get the funding he desired. Because on the other side of this call was a 60-year-old no-nonsense New Yorker named Don Valentine, who also happened to be a genius investor and the founder of Sequoia Capital, one of the largest venture capital firms in the entire world. Valentine's track record spoke for itself. He had invested millions of dollars into many of the biggest tech names very early on. Everything he touched had turned to gold. So if there was one man's support that Jensen Huang needed to gain, it was Don Valentine's. On the phone, Wilfred Corrigan gave a very clear message to Don Valentine.
And then he picked up the phone and he called Don Valentine. And he called Don and he says, Don, I'm going to send a kid over. I want you to give him money. He's one of the best employees LSI Logic ever had.
And so a meeting was set. Only Jensen didn't have the business plan to present. He had bought a book to learn how to write a business plan, but after 3 chapters, he realized he didn't have enough time to finish the book. Why read when you can jump straight into the deep end, he thought. So Jensen threw together a series of slides with persuasion, an early Mac version of PowerPoint. And this presentation will cover why they believed that the endless growth of CPU power wasn't the future. Instead, it would be graphics that were going to be in huge demand, and they would be the driving force behind the computer revolution. As Jensen arrived at Valentine's office, he was a nervous wreck. The days of talking with Chris and Curtis about what to eat for lunch were long behind him. Now, he was sitting across the table from the most powerful man in tech. And straight away, Valentine asked him one blunt question that he asked every single startup he met with. Who cares? Was Nvidia really going to be the company to beat the rest of the field? And once they got into the presentation, things only got worse. Valentine questioned whether Jensen fully understood that his company was relying on the success of another high-risk startup company.
In order for Nvidia to succeed, we needed another startup to succeed, and that other startup was Electronic Arts. And then on the way out, he reminded me that Electronic Arts' CTO is 14 years old and had to be driven to work by his mom. And he just wanted to remind me that that's who I'm relying on.
Suddenly, the pressure hit Jensen like a freight train. As an engineer turned entrepreneur, he was completely out of his element. He couldn't put his ideas together well, and the pitch turned into a complete train wreck. When he sat down as the meeting finished, he felt defeated and certain that Valentine wouldn't gamble on such a risky startup. Don Valentine leaned back silently and took a long look at Jensen. He realized that here was a young man who clearly had unique knowledge, was passionate about his business, and who could be trusted, even if his presentation skills needed a lot of work. So to Jensen's surprise, Valentine made him an offer, agreeing to invest $1 million into Nvidia, putting the company's valuation at $7 million and immediately making them one of the most valuable startups in tech history. Jensen was shocked, but before he left the room, Don Valentine had a word of warning.
And what he said to me the last time as he decided to invest in our company, he says, if you lose my money, I'll kill you.
And just like that, Don Valentine and Sequoia Capital became the first investor in Nvidia. And with Sequoia behind them, it opened up a bunch of other doors in the venture capital world for Jensen to be able to grow his funding round to $20 million. With that money, Nvidia opened up their first office inside of a strip mall with 20 employees on their payroll, and right away, they all got to work building their first product, the NV1 chip. Jensen had climbed the hill to lead the company to huge financial backing and put a serious team underneath him. However, as quickly as that excitement came, he looked around to see mountains of competition. There were hundreds of similar startups popping up everywhere, with 24 of those dedicated to the same exact mission, producing graphic chips as he was, which meant his idea wasn't so special anymore. Nvidia would instead need a bold business strategy to succeed. And that's where Jensen made his first of 3 life-changing bets: to go all in on a market that barely existed. The 1970s and 80s were the golden age for arcade games. Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Tetris were all instant classics. Then over time, games started moving into people's homes as well. The console wars between gaming giants Sega, Nintendo, and Atari were just heating up, and it was perfect timing for startup tech companies to innovate. Because the first video games were made by graphic artists building images with very basic shapes, pretty much just lines and dots. But as Nvidia entered the market in the early 1990s, a new technique had emerged, using 3-dimensional polygons, where now complex images could now be created. With this advancement, game developers were building immersive worlds with higher quality graphics than ever before. But that's where Jensen Huang made two decisions that would define Nvidia's journey for the next decade. First, he decided Nvidia would go against the popular polygon-based methodology, instead using their own technique called quadratic texture mapping. Nvidia was the only graphics company taking this approach. It was a huge gamble, and if their technology didn't get picked by the rest of the tech industry, Nvidia would be stranded all on its own. Second, they would focus on building chips for personal computers, not gaming consoles that were packaged for casual gamers, because PCs were exploding in popularity as well since they were much more multifunctional. And Nvidia was betting that PC gamers would be the ones who were demanding top-of-the-line graphics. Jensen approached a semiconductor company, SGS Thompson, to help build their chip. He also struck a deal with Diamond Multimedia to help sell the NV1 as the Diamond Edge 3D graphics card. With all of their manufacturers and business partners lined up, the NV1 chip was announced to the public in May of 1995. The news of the NV1 also attracted the interest of Japanese video game maker Sega, who was looking to get an advantage over Sony and Nintendo. Jensen learned about Sega's interests and made sure there was a joypad port for the NV1, making it easier to convert games from Sega to the PC. Nvidia looked to be entering the market at just the perfect time. It was the best equipped company to power the video game boom and rake in billions of dollars in the process. Nvidia had already spent $10 million to develop the NV1, so it needed this chip to succeed. And Jensen knew that this success depended heavily on the Sega Saturn, Sega's newest console, to be a massive hit. And while the Saturn did start out in a positive direction, becoming Sega's most successful gaming console in Japan, things started to take a turn for the worse once it rolled out in North American and European markets. The Saturn was unfortunately a victim of poor timing, being sandwiched in between the release of Sony's mega popular PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. With those two gaming giants eating up most of the market share, the Saturn became a commercial failure. And even though the Nvidia's NV1 was perfectly designed for porting all of Sega's classic games into the PC, Jensen's critical mistake was relying completely on the success of another company's product to determine whether or not his chip would be a winner. Then, back-to-back disasters completely pulled the ground from underneath Nvidia. First, Microsoft, which designed the operating system running on virtually every PC on the market, grew tired of dealing with all the different types of software and hardware. So it decided to create Direct3D and launched it with Windows 95, which was horrible news for Nvidia because Direct3D used triangle polygon rendering, making the NV1 chip incompatible with Windows devices. And shortly after that, the NV1's entire business strategy was destroyed when the cost of PC memory plummeted. Nvidia's plan to save PC owners money by optimizing their memory with the NV1 graphics card became obsolete. The market had turned against Jensen, and there was almost no money left in the company accounts. With no clear way forward and time running out, it would take a miracle to save Nvidia, and Jensen would get one final chance to create the perfect chip in order to succeed. Nvidia had been too far ahead of the curve. Jensen needed to find a way to meet demands of the market and create futuristic technology at the same time, all while Nvidia was fighting for its survival. His next move was going to define the trajectory of his life. But Jensen wasn't a quitter. He looked ahead and continued development of Nvidia's next chip, the NV2. But when Sega ran into financial problems, it pulled the plug on a deal to use the NV2 for its future projects. Upon hearing this news, Jensen flew to Sega's headquarters in Japan and pleaded with executives to sign on again with Nvidia so he could save his company. But Sega was not in any shape to help Nvidia because they weren't looking great financially either. Failing so badly with the Sega Saturn launch had put a dent in the company. And while Sega was growing at the time locally in Japan, their exports in the West were failing miserably. So Sega rejected Jensen, telling him that it wasn't a good time for them to bet on an experimental startup like Nvidia. It looked like Jensen Huang's first 2 product releases were going to be complete failures. Jensen's co-founder, Curtis Bream, who had been serving as Nvidia's lead hardware architect, fell on his sword and resigned from that position. More than anything, Jensen knew they first needed to find money and find it fast. The Sequoia funding had dried up and Nvidia was on the brink of bankruptcy. So when Jensen approached Sega one last time, he went straight to an old ally, the CEO of Sega America, Amaji-san, who was a key figure in the initial partnership between Sega and Nvidia. But after their last project together failed, Jensen didn't expect to find support from his former business partner. Regardless, he knew he had to exhaust all of his options just in case. Which is why he was completely shocked when Amaji-san said yes, writing Jensen a check for $5 million and single-handedly giving Nvidia one final chance. On the way back home, Jensen knew they had to change strategy immediately. He realized that they no longer had an X factor of being the new hot name and were starting years behind the competition. There were already 2 other established companies eating up most of the computer graphics market at that time. Meaning if Nvidia wasn't fast, there wouldn't be anything left for them. So Jensen decided to abandon their complicated quadratic approach and pull the plug on the NV2 chip altogether. That way, he could rejoin the Polygon design race in order to fit into the current tech market that Microsoft had created, rather than attempt to build a brand new market reliant on other companies. And what emerged was the design for the NV3 chip, which they rebranded into the Rivia 128, a state-of-the-art graphics card that would double the processing speed of its competitors. But with Nvidia's bank account draining fast, Jensen was forced to fire half of his workers in order to cut costs and save the company. Nvidia was down to its bare bones and every employee was working overtime. They didn't even have the resources to fully roll out the new chip's testing process, because a full round of testing would have left them bankrupt before they had even launched.
And so you decide to do the entire testing in simulation rather than ever receiving a physical prototype. You commission the production run sight unseen with the rest of the company's money. Yeah. So you're betting it all right here on the Riva 128. Yeah. It comes back, and of the 32 DirectX blend modes, it supports 8 of them. And you have to convince the market to buy it, and you got to convince developers not to use anything but those 8 blend modes. Walk us through what that felt like.
The other 24 weren't that important.
And with all the pressure of his investors and employees resting on his back, Jensen released the Rivia 128, which debuted on April 1st, 1997. And it turned out to be an immediate hit on a handful of technology blogs. Jensen had delivered on his bold claims of doubling the processing power, meaning it could render and generate computer graphics much faster than anyone else on the market. Within 4 months, 1 million Rivia 128 units had been sold. And just like that, Jensen breathed life back into Nvidia, pulling it back from the brink of destruction. But even with Nvidia's first big success under its belt, Jensen kept applying the make it or break it mindset. Without pausing for a moment to rest, he immediately got back to work on a conveyor belt of new products, successfully launching the Rivia TNT, the Vanta, and the Rivia TNT2, which all helped Nvidia reach new heights in the tech world. In just 2 short years, Jensen's company had transformed from a failure on the brink of bankruptcy into a major force in the graphics card industry. Then, in 1999, Nvidia's big moment came. It was time for an IPO. With an extra 3.5 million Nvidia stock shares offered to the public, raising $42 million. And within a day, the stock share price has already skyrocketed by 175%. Jensen, Chris, and Curtis, along with all of their early investors like Don Valentine, were instantly made into multimillionaires. And Nvidia had a huge reward in store for its new shareholders too, a chip that would make headlines around the world. Because this time, they had created a product so advanced that it demanded a new name. Jensen called this new product a graphics processing unit, or GPU for short. It was the first of its kind in all of history. So what was so special about this GPU? Well, the computer chip had parallel processing technology inside of it, meaning the transform and lighting tasks that were usually handled by separate parts of a computer were now powered by the same GeForce graphics card. This streamlined the entire process, making it much more efficient, effective, and powerful. And it meant that the GeForce processor was the first computer chip in history that could take over all the processing functions required to produce 3D graphics. Thus, the GeForce 256 marked the beginning of an entirely new era. And not just for video games either, but for videos, photos, and simulation software. If the CPU was considered the brains of a computer, then the GPU was now its soul. PC makers Dell, Compaq, and Micron all immediately signed on to use the GeForce 256. But this new success also attracted an offer from an unlikely partner. Microsoft wanted in. Yes, the same company that had tanked Jensen's NV1 chip just a few years ago now wanted to help Nvidia get to the next level. Because Microsoft was in the process of developing a video game console that could compete with the Sony PlayStation, and they thought Nvidia's GeForce technology would be the perfect way to power their secret gaming project. They ended up writing Nvidia a check for $200 million, so Jensen and his team could start building a graphics processor unit specifically for the first Xbox consoles. At this point, Nvidia wasn't riding the wave anymore, it was creating one. And once Jensen earned a seat at the table with big tech, he started making some big power plays of his own. As the year 2000 approached, one of Jensen's main competitors had claimed that Nvidia had stolen its patented technology. 3DFX had been one of the most influential graphics companies throughout the 1990s, but Nvidia had quickly left them in the dust thanks to its continuous innovation. So Jensen responded to the lawsuit strongly, first by countersuing them, then putting an end to the dispute once and for all by buying out 3DFX for $70 million, taking ownership of all the patents and stripping the rest. With that move, Jensen had tightened his stranglehold on the entire computer graphics market. But in a blossoming computer industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, Nvidia was still a small fish in a very big pond. One that still belonged to a handful of massive global corporations. So when one of these giants started going after Nvidia, it would take all of Jensen's leadership skills, resilience, and guts to defeat the tech industry's biggest bully. First though, Jensen would have to settle lawsuits with the US government and fix a $500 million mistake. In the early 2000s, the computer chip market was like the wild, wild west. There were billions to be made, and not every company played fair. Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computer, accused chip manufacturers of operating like cartels, colluding to keep prices high. And he was right. Later in court, these cartels, which included Hynix, Infineon Technologies, and Samsung, admitted to keeping prices artificially high between 1999 and 2002. While their price fixing only equated to around a $10 price difference for each computer unit, this translated into billions of lost profits for companies like Dell. A handful of Samsung executives were even sent to jail for their crimes, sending a clear warning to the rest of the tech world: don't manipulate your pricing. But with this practice going on for decades across multiple industries, from oil and auto parts to even vitamins and pharmaceuticals, a major crackdown was just beginning. And the semiconductor industry was no different, because no company was safe from investigation, including Nvidia, especially when Jensen had a perfect record of continuous quarterly growth in profits. In fact, Nvidia had never even reported a loss since becoming a public company. And on top of that, in 2008, they broke the $1 billion mark in revenue, a massive milestone for most companies. So it was no surprise that their stock rose by 18% in a single day after one of these quarterly reports was released. But some shareholders were suspicious. They suspected that something shady may have been going on behind the scenes in order to achieve these historic numbers. So a group of them claimed that Nvidia's stock had been artificially pumped up. And this accusation prompted the US Securities and Exchange Commission, otherwise known as the SEC, to look into the matter. And when they did, they found a lot of strange activity. The most damning of which was that millions of dollars had been shuffled around through an agreement with a supplier in order to delay payments. It was the only way for Nvidia to avoid spoiling their perfect record of quarterly growth. The finger was immediately pointed at former CFO Christine Holberg as the scapegoat, who by then had already resigned from the company. She was later found guilty for accounting fraud and ordered to pay a fine of $672,000 for lying to investors. In the scheme of things, this fight over a few $1 million was a relatively small amount compared to Nvidia's nearly $2 billion in total revenue at the time. But it created a much larger, unsettling question. Was Jensen's obsession with perfection starting to get Nvidia into trouble? And things went from bad to worse when Nvidia was hit by an even larger scandal. Thousands of GeForce 8600M graphics processors were turning out to be defective. Jensen's company was taking a beating, both in public image and in their bank accounts, because this mistake cost Nvidia more than $450 million to fix, because they needed to replace all of the defective GPUs. And it couldn't have come at a worse time, right in the middle of a global financial crisis during 2008. Sensing how poorly the company was doing, Jensen volunteered to drop his base pay down to $1, which still left him with stock options worth over $3.3 million per year. But this was more of a sign that Nvidia's skyrocketing growth was finally slowing down. Jensen needed some new momentum to get things rolling again. But right when he needed to catch a break the most, another lawsuit was filed that would threaten the entire livelihood of Nvidia's future. Because this time, it wasn't from shareholders, the US government, or unhappy customers. It was coming from computer giant Intel, and they were coming for everything.
You and Intel have butted heads more and more, it seems. And I'll ask it simply, why do you hate Intel so much?
Well, we don't hate Intel so much, but they do hate us a lot.
Because Intel had been the titan of the tech industry for decades, going all the way back to the late 1960s, where they developed foundational technology that the computer revolution was built on. Most notably, their memory chips and their central processing units, also known as CPUs, were considered the brains of millions of computers on the market. In fact, in 1993, the year Nvidia was founded, Intel's market cap was already $14.2 billion. But Jensen Huang believed Intel had become too big and they were refusing to adapt. Instead, he believed they were taking a different tactic, using their size to bully the rest of the industry as they desperately tried to hang on to power. But he kept these thoughts to himself and remained friendly with the tech powerhouse, even striking a cross-licensing deal with Intel in 2004 so both companies could use each other's patents. At the time, Intel was the world's biggest chip maker, and working within their architecture was essential for any computing company to survive, including Nvidia. But just a short 5 years later, in 2009, Intel wanted out of their agreement. They even accused Nvidia of making Intel-compatible products without a license. At its core, Intel was trying to freeze Nvidia out of the market, stopping them from supplying GPUs for critical technology like Apple's MacBook computers and laptops. But Jensen didn't back down. Instead, he fired back and countersued, claiming Nvidia did have the rights, and it was Intel taking Nvidia's hard-earned technology. Because Jensen could see the real reason why Intel was trying to shut Nvidia out, which meant he was now the biggest threat to Intel. But Jensen wasn't scared. He was actually looking forward to taking them on in court.
Am I correct? That's scheduled to go to court later this year?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So when you say you're looking forward to it, you mean you're not interested in settling for a financial settlement earlier?
There's no reason to do that.
So what transpired was a 2-year legal battle that resulted in a massive settlement in 2011. And who came out on top? Jensen and Nvidia. Intel was forced to hand over a staggering $1.5 billion to Nvidia to put an end to the legal battle, along with agreeing to a new extension of their original cross-licensing agreement. Over the next few years, Intel promised to get revenge, telling the world that it was going to build its own GPU, going with a project codenamed Laravel that was plagued by constant delays. Jensen believed it was only a desperate attempt to damage the value of Nvidia. When Intel finally admitted defeat, abandoning Larrabee and announcing that it was exiting the graphics chip business, Nvidia's stock jumped by 22%. Jensen had conquered Intel and beaten another bully in his life. His rise from complete poverty in Asia to defeating one of the most dominant tech companies in the world was a testament to his character. And now, it was his time to go on the offensive. But as Nvidia kept growing further and further, the company started making promises it couldn't keep. And the line between Nvidia and Jensen Huang were starting to blur. Nvidia was fast becoming intertwined with the name Jensen Huang.
You're the CEO. Your job is to architect this company. That's my first job, to create the conditions by which you can do your life's work. And the architecture has to be right.
After the company went public, Jensen slowly consolidated power. Out of the 3 Nvidia co-founders, one was about to bow out when Curtis Preem left the company in 2003. And sadly, his life went in a completely different direction, rapidly spiraling out of control. Restraining orders, arrests, and court appearances plagued the next decade of his life. So when Jensen's other co-founder, Chris Malchowski, left the board of directors only to stay on as an Nvidia fellow, that meant there was only one co-founder left. The same man who was reluctant to join Nvidia in the first place, Jensen. But now, he wasn't going anywhere. And by 2008, he was the company's largest shareholder, owning 5.1% of Nvidia. With its revenue of $4.1 billion, Nvidia was edging Jensen towards billionaire status. But still, others are convinced it was only because he subscribed to this channel. Jensen's team started to grow the reputation for making the hardware that futuristic technology should be built on. But beyond the sheer horsepower of its processors, the secret sauce that truly set Nvidia apart from the rest of the pack was its uniquely closed-off software ecosystem. An extremely risky strategy Jensen stole from tech legend Steve Jobs. And just like how Jobs forced Apple to create a restrictive operating system and hardware that wasn't compatible with competitors' products, Nvidia decided to use the same exact blueprint to close out their competition from its software and hardware as well. Meaning, if customers wanted to use Nvidia's highly sought-after hardware, they would need to use Jensen's entire ecosystem with it. This all-or-nothing strategy would be very effective at boxing out competitors, but only if customers decided that they couldn't live without with one part of Nvidia's product line enough that they wouldn't mind using the rest of it. And while Nvidia's bold plan was slow to start, their most important leap forward in this closed ecosystem approach came in 2007 with the release of a software called Compute Unified Device Architecture, known as CUDA for short. This next-generation software transformed NVIDIA GPUs from advanced video cards with only one primary use into ultra-powerful processors that could be used on hundreds of different applications. And the tech world quickly took notice of CUDA, making NVIDIA the preferred hardware platform that would power many of the most advanced tech and apps that you use every day. Jensen, who was in complete control of the company, started to attract mainstream media attention. He was becoming known for his calm demeanor, no-nonsense attitude, and his signature look, a sleek black leather jacket. But behind the calm and charismatic public appearances, Jensen was meticulous about the workplace he created. He knew how revolutionary the right company culture could be. You see, all the way back in 1984, the year Jensen graduated from college, his first employer, AMD, had been included in a book entitled The 100 Best Companies to Work For in America, which Jensen took note of when deciding where to start his career. And even when he broke off to make his own company, it was his connections at AMD and LSI Logic, along with their strong reputations, that first connected NVIDIA to Sequoia Capital. Jensen's approach was rare for a tech CEO. His first priority was full transparency, making sure every level of the company was on the same page, and putting in place as few management layers as possible, avoiding the dreaded one-on-one meetings at all costs that most tech companies are well known for.
I don't do one-on-ones. and I don't, my staff is quite large, and almost everything that I say to everybody all at the same time. And the reason for that is because I don't really believe there's any information that I operate on that somehow only one or two people should hear about.
He also chose never to wear a watch, showing that his undivided attention would be dedicated to any task that was at hand, whether it be a meeting, an interview, a presentation, or a deep dive review into the engineering of a product.
Very few people know this, but I don't wear a watch. And the reason why I don't wear a watch is now is the most important time. Just dedicate yourself to now.
The CEO's role, as Jensen saw it, was to focus on the big picture issues, the direction of the company, and to be an overall visionary. This focus was how he seemed to be able to see far beyond the horizon when it came to tech trends. By focusing on perfecting technologies that didn't have any concrete applications yet, Nvidia seemed to be in the right place at the right time again and again. And as it became more common, it was clear this was no accident. Jensen's big picture ideas always seemed much larger than other tech leaders.
For 30 years, what Nvidia realized we had to do is, in order to create the conditions by which somebody could buy our products, we had to go invent this new market.
But at the same time, Jensen was fully capable of getting hands-on with the tech as well, filling his days talking with employees all over the campus, in the cafeteria, in hallways, and in between meetings. His mentality could be demanding but fair.
Well, let me tell you what some of the people who you work with said about you. Demanding, perfectionist, not easy to work for. All that sound right?
Perfectly, yeah. It should be like that. If you want to do extraordinary things, it shouldn't be easy.
He saw himself as the custodian of culture, which he protected through a rigorous selection process for all new employees, looking for qualities that other tech companies didn't consider. It wasn't only intelligence that Nvidia desired, but brains, guts, and heart that Jensen knew would make a great employee.
That choice ultimately goes into what the bucket I call culture. We are intensely selective in our company with respect to engineers. And so we happen to be intensely selective when it comes down to the people that we bring to our company. Not just alone in their intelligence, but also their heart, and also their courage.
And this approach, by any metric, was working exceptionally well. Jensen was quickly becoming an inspiring tech executive, known for his leadership both inside and outside of his company. In fact, when looking at over 5,000 reviews from Glassdoor.com, more than 9 out of 10 employees recommended Nvidia as a positive work environment. And ultimately, one of the most incredible feats Jensen has pulled off as a tech leader is the almost universal support and admiration that he's earned from the people that work for him, especially when considering how that stacks up against his other peers in tech. While reading through dozens of reviews on Jensen and his company, one phrase stands out above the rest: empowerment. Because Jensen realized from early on that he could be demanding and challenge his employees to do extraordinary things, but only if he made them feel empowered to execute on these impossible tasks that he asked them to achieve.
You want a company that's as small as possible, not as large as possible.
Yeah.
It needs to be as large as necessary to do the job well, but to be as small as possible. And so naturally, you want to empower people.
So this also meant allowing his employees to take ownership of their ideas, letting them get their work done in the best way they see fit. But most importantly, it meant helping them cut through all the red tape that usually paralyzes most large corporations from doing effective collaboration, especially across departments. And these results may have been extremely positive, but not everyone has agreed with Jensen's leadership style. He's known for having a very low tolerance for bad performance and is hyper-focused on making Nvidia as efficient as possible. But beyond the company culture, Nvidia's statements haven't always aligned with their actions. For years, Nvidia's leadership has promoted its environmental sustainability policies as being some of the best in the world. But these claims can often be extremely misleading. For instance, Nvidia's latest 41-page sustainability report shows that their technology ranked highly in environmental watchdog charts like the Green 100. But that report doesn't tell the whole story. especially when considering Nvidia's hardware is used for some of the highest energy consuming activities on the planet. Jensen tries to counter this inconvenient truth by leaning on theoretical math, making claims like applying AI saves energy and AI eliminates waste.
And so the thing to remember, you teach the AI model a few times, but you use it continuously everywhere around the world. And so the benefits of using AI to predict weather instead of using supercomputers to predict weather as we do now can save a ton of energy. So artificial intelligence consumes a lot of energy to train. It also saves a lot of energy when you consume it. Because ultimately, it's not about training the model, it's about using the model.
While this may potentially be true in some future hypothetical scenario, when you look closely at the current situation of Nvidia's environmental impact, you'll find that they sold 3.76 million data center focused GPUs last year alone, with each unit producing more than 350 watts per hour. That means Nvidia's GPUs are consuming roughly the same amount of power as 1 million households every single day, equivalent to the entire state of Nevada. But these environmental concerns were only just beginning. An emerging industry was about to blow all of Nvidia's sustainability goals completely out of the water, all fueled by a strange new digital asset, Bitcoin. And little did people realize that this blossoming cryptocurrency would create a tech rivalry like the world had never seen before. One that would spawn a decade's worth of lawsuits, allegations of fraud, and the rise of another brilliant CEO who could actually hold their own against King Jensen. But the biggest twist of all, this fierce rival came from Jensen's own family. When Jensen Huang started his engineering career back at AMD in the 1980s, little did he know he would be battling his former colleagues in the most intense showdown of his entire career. Because back then, AMD had built its empire by designing microprocessors and flash memory, which didn't really compete with Nvidia's key products. But in the early 2000s, things changed. AMD could feel the momentum rushing towards GPUs and began creeping into Nvidia's territory. It started when Nvidia released the GeForce 3 series, which AMD responded to by creating its own competitor, the Radeon 9700 Pro. Then came Nvidia's GeForce 6 series, only to be countered by AMD's Radeon X1000. AMD was going blow for blow with Nvidia in the world of high-end graphics cards. And by the middle of 2005, the GPU market was roughly split in half between both of these companies. Then, in 2006, AMD made its boldest move yet by buying out Canadian graphics card company ATI Technologies.
We are welcoming one of the great leaders of the semiconductor industry, ATI, to the AMD family, an acquisition that we're hoping to close later next month.
The price tag for ATI was $5.4 billion, around half of AMD's total market cap. It was a huge gamble, and it made one thing crystal clear. The only competitors left in the graphics card business were Nvidia and AMD. But in order to try to catch Nvidia, AMD needed to think differently, instead of trying to beat Nvidia at their own game. So as Jensen continued to steer Nvidia in the direction of producing the most sophisticated and high-quality graphics cards possible, AMD instead focused on the mid-range category, ones that were much more affordable for the average PC gamer. And while the strategies of both companies found success, Jensen's approach clearly worked much better. By 2008, the market share split was 63 to 37 in favor of Nvidia. But soon, there was much more at stake for them than simple PC gamers. Because a small community of crypto enthusiasts were working on an idea for a new digital currency. And in 2009, someone from their community, an anonymous creator known as Satoshi Nakamoto, launched the world's first fully operational cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. And it was the computing power underneath that drove this eventual fight for billions between Nvidia and AMD. Because at the heart of Bitcoin's technology is this concept called mining, which is how new records, also known as blocks, are added to the Bitcoin blockchain. And this mining process is done by having computers solve extremely difficult mathematical equations and cryptology puzzles, also known as hashes. Bitcoin mining got competitive very quickly when people realized that the winners of each of these puzzles were rewarded with Bitcoin and that it could be sold for real money. Therefore, the higher a person's computer power, the quicker their computer could earn that commission. And after a few Bitcoin miners realized that GPUs were much faster than CPUs at mining Bitcoin, the battle for all crypto computing kicked off.
My computer kind of sucks because I have a very, very slow processor, but if you have a more up-to-date graphics card and processor, you should be generating at a lot faster rates.
Because as Bitcoin's value climbed higher and gained more and more mainstream attention, many crypto mining businesses began to emerge, buying up the strongest hardware on the market. And in the early days of Bitcoin, AMD's GPUs were consistently outperforming Nvidia's for mining. However, in just 2 short years, Nvidia had closed the performance gap quite a bit as the most powerful mining tool on the market. But as the crypto market evolved, specialized processors temporarily overtook GPUs as a technology of choice for earning Bitcoin. But that wouldn't last long. Soon, AMD and Nvidia would return stronger than ever. With both GPU giants temporarily sidelined in the battle for crypto mining, AMD decided to make some leadership changes. A new CEO was announced in 2014. She was an MIT graduate with an impressive resume, decorated with successes at other major tech hardware companies like Texas Instruments and IBM. She also just happened to be from the southwestern province of Taiwan, the same exact place where Jensen Huang was born. And it wasn't until later that the world would discover that Jensen's new counterpart at Nvidia's arch rival was none other than his cousin, a woman named Lisa Su.
We're number 1 today in game consoles and gaming. Our technology powers more than 220 million game consoles.
And Lisa had ambitious plans for AMD. Almost immediately, she started taking the fight directly to Jensen, pushing AMD's GPU power output ahead of Nvidia's performance. This development started making AMD the fan favorite among gamers around the world. By the time crypto mining swung back to GPUs, thousands of different cryptocurrencies were being brought to the market. Some of the most popular emerging currencies, like Ethereum, were particularly resistant to ASIC mining chips that Bitcoin fans were typically using, sending crypto miners right back to using GPUs by the masses.
I told you guys, you think just this Ethereum ASIC miner is the best and last? Absolutely not.
But this growing demand meant that it was almost impossible to find AMD cards in stock. And on top of that, AMD's more powerful chips didn't always translate into more market share either. Instead, people found that AMD's GPUs often struggled to reach the full potential of the power stats that they boldly claimed. And AMD's hardware was only compounding this issue of trust by getting a bad reputation for overheating and making loud noises while being used out in the real world.
When I added a video card right here. So when I add this video card, the CPU started overheating.
But even with all that information, Jensen was not about to let his cousin outshine him in innovation either. So by 2016, Nvidia had caught up to AMD in performance tests as well. So when things started to heat back up in the crypto space, Nvidia was perfectly positioned to capitalize over AMD and all of the other crypto mining competitors as well. Jensen recognized that this made cryptocurrency mining a very important market for Nvidia's growth. For him, the blockchain was about to become a fundamental new form of computing.
Our GPU is essentially the world's highest volume, largest installed base supercomputer. And that's the reason why almost everybody who has a new cryptocurrency, a new, if you will, digital currency, launches it on an Nvidia GPU, because we are the world's largest volume, high-performance computing processor.
It was no wonder he was so enthusiastic. Nvidia was raking in more revenue than ever before. During 2017, crypto miners bought a total of 3 million GPU units within a year, skyrocketing Nvidia's yearly revenue to a record high of $9.7 billion. In the largest crypto gold rush to date, Nvidia was the biggest shop for the shovels and pickaxes. However, just like with the success that AMD was seeing, there was a downside. Nvidia's main original customer base was suffering. Gamers looking to get GPUs to play their favorite video games were often left empty-handed. And even though Nvidia asked retailers to give priority to gamers rather than miners, they couldn't stop the tidal wave of crypto mining purchases. To outsiders, these trends signaled that Nvidia's business model may have become too dependent on cryptocurrency, which many viewed as a passing fad. But Jensen assured investors, promising that the value of the company wasn't being gambled away on a speculative digital currency. And according to Nvidia officials, it was still gaming that was bringing in the majority of Nvidia's revenue. Because according to the company, crypto was an important factor in other markets, but it hadn't made a significant dent into its traditional customer base.
Well, our core growth drivers come from video games. It comes from professional graphics visualization, like what you see over my shoulder.
However, inside the company, Nvidia employees were concerned. Many knew that the increase in sales was due entirely thanks to the crypto mining industry. To help calm investors' fears, Nvidia released a mining-only card so that its gaming and crypto business segments could be more isolated. But it was too late. In 2018, Nvidia's house of cards was starting to fall apart. As many investors speculated, miners stopped buying GPUs shortly after crypto prices plunged. Jensen thought that demand would recover, but when it didn't, Nvidia was stuck with 12 weeks of inventory that it couldn't get rid of. This led to Nvidia's quarterly earnings dropping by $500 million, one of the worst quarterly performances in the company's 25-year history. And so, a mass sell-off of Nvidia's stock ensued. And in the space of just a few days, a staggering $23 billion of Nvidia's market value was wiped out. Jensen was shocked. He admitted that it was a crypto hangover, and that it was as surprising to him as it was to all of his shareholders.
Last year, this time, we really enjoyed the perfect storm in our company. Our graphics business was affected, our data business was affected. As a result, we went into a slowdown a bit.
But not everyone who invested in Nvidia's stock was satisfied. Instead, they were angry and out for blood, launching a lawsuit alleging that Jensen and the other executives had concealed the truth. Their case against Nvidia estimated that the company had underreported the sale of GeForce GPUs crypto miners by more than $1.3 billion. And because they incorrectly labeled many of these GPU sales by assigning them to the gaming sector instead of cryptocurrency, it made Nvidia's growth look much more sustainable than it actually was. The US government and the SEC agreed, forcing Nvidia to pay a negotiated $5.5 million penalty, which feels like a complete slap on the wrist, considering Nvidia was making nearly $10 billion a year at the time, and they didn't even have to admit any wrongdoing. But by the time this lawsuit was settled in 2020, Nvidia was having the opposite problem, because instead of having far too much stock available, they were having a chip shortage, and it was impacting the global economy.
We've seen the chip shortage hit many industries, from consumer electronics to cars to computer parts. In a nutshell, demand for products with chips has risen since the start of the pandemic, and chip manufacturers have been struggling to meet this demand.
Gamers caused a spike in demand for Nvidia GPUs, driven by huge performance gains in their newest chip, the 3000 series, which many believed instantly made older graphics cards noticeably outdated.
We are super pleased with 3070, 3080, and 3090, the first three members of the Ampere generation.
Then, the coronavirus pandemic halted most manufacturing. And with all that chaos going on, crypto miners started buying up inventory again as well, as Bitcoin prices started to soar once more. As the great chip shortage of 2020 and 2021 began to halt trade, Nvidia's revenue remained static. Seemingly a bad sign for a company that usually averaged a growth rate of 24% a year. But on the stock market, Nvidia's value was catapulting to all-time new highs, taking their market cap from $359 billion to a staggering $823 billion in under a year. investors around the world were realizing that every sector of the economy depended on semiconductors and advanced computing chips, powering trillions of dollars of activity. From mobile phones and laptops to home appliances and cars, the modern world was now running on Nvidia. In total, the global chip shortage affected an estimated 169 industries around the world. It was clear Nvidia's high-end GPUs were critical for the future of technology. The crypto mining boom had proven just how powerful these chips could be for supercomputing. But Jensen wasn't happy with how his company was making its money. He knew it was hurting Nvidia's global environmental impact. But even more important than Jensen, crypto's boom or bust nature was really bad for his business. He wanted to get rid of the high demand from crypto mining that clogged up Nvidia's other orders, and he wanted to do it now. So he made a difficult decision. Jensen would immediately take steps to systematically cut ties with the crypto mining industry that helped bring Nvidia to new heights over the previous 5 years, instructing his engineering teams to start reconfiguring their GeForce GPUs to reduce overall mining speed. And within a couple of years, the company had completely turned its back on cryptocurrencies, saying they didn't bring anything useful for society. Many thought this decision was crazy at the time. They believed by cutting off the crypto mining market, that Jensen was essentially killing off his golden goose for no logical reason. But Jensen did have a good reason. Because he could already see the next game-changing industry for Nvidia to take over. One that he had been waiting to see come to life for nearly a decade as its technology finally started catching up to his own. And soon, this new tech would be coming to take the rest of the world by storm, becoming the single key ingredient to transform Nvidia into the most powerful company in the world. Around 2010, Jensen learned that a group of Stanford PhD researchers were using Nvidia's products for something interesting that he hadn't ever heard of before. It wasn't video games or sophisticated visuals, but instead, they were working on a niche academic research area, deep learning. And these scientists were creating complex computer algorithms that mimic the human brain, calling it artificial intelligence, or AI for short. These researchers soon figured out that the most dominant tool to train these AI models were GPUs. Because instead of building an algorithm piece by piece using CPUs, Nvidia's unique parallel processing ability allowed for many pieces of data to be processed all at the same time. This is where Nvidia's risky closed software ecosystem really started to shine. With its special programming language Coda, the enormous potential of Nvidia's GPUs were finally unlocked. Without initially realizing it, Jensen had slowly been packing a powder keg filled with all the materials for an explosive new technology revolution. Now all it needed was a flicker of a flame to light the fuse and explode. And that breakthrough came in 2012 when a research team at the University of Toronto created a deep learning model that could identify images with astonishing accuracy.
We invented this capability, and then one day, the researchers that were creating deep learning discovered this architecture, because this architecture turns out to have been perfect for them.
Perfect for AI.
Perfect for AI.
Soon, dozens of similar projects sprouted up, and money began pouring into AI startups, with tech giants like Google and Microsoft scrambling for control. They were all chasing to create the strongest artificial intelligence, the kind of program that would be able to have sharp reasoning, self-awareness, and behave just like a human. Only it would be millions of times faster and more intelligent. In 2015, a nonprofit research lab surfaced to act as a counterbalance to the huge investments being made by big tech firms in AI. It was being backed by some of the biggest stars in Silicon Valley, and their mission was to produce transparent AI research, to develop the technology responsibly, which would hopefully prevent it from spiraling out of control. They called this lab OpenAI. Jensen could also see the potential dangers of these enhancements getting into the wrong hands as well. So instead of pledging a donation, he gave OpenAI something even more valuable. The very first DGX-1, an Nvidia supercomputer that could perform a quadrillion operations every second.
This is the first one we've ever shipped.
In 2016, Jensen delivered Nvidia's AI supercomputer, the first of its kind, to Elon Musk, then a board member of OpenAI.
And 7 years later, that seed Jensen planted by giving OpenAI its first supercomputer started to look extremely fruitful when OpenAI would release its first mainstream product, ChatGPT, to the public in 2022. Their conversational chatbot could instantly generate content, from essays and medical advice to advanced coding. ChatGPT instantly went viral, hitting more than 1 million users within its first 5 days, and earning them a $13 billion investment from Microsoft. Shortly after that, AI became the hottest market for tech startups on the planet, with hundreds of new companies popping up every day, generating nearly $50 billion in venture capitalist funding across the world. Jensen, who had been advancing his ultra-fast processing technology for decades, was ready and waiting to take full advantage of this viral tech trend.
When AI took off, so did Jensen Huang's reputation. He's now a Silicon Valley celebrity.
For example, a week before ChatGPT 3's initial release, Nvidia had partnered with Microsoft to build one of the strongest AI computers in all of history, connecting tens of thousands of its AI GPUs all together at the same time. At this point, Jensen's commitment to making the highest quality software and Nvidia's CODA software ecosystem combined to send Nvidia's market cap straight into the stratosphere. The sales price for a single Nvidia H100 GPU was just over $30,000, but the entire inventory sold out almost immediately, with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg announcing that his company would be spending billions of dollars to get their hands on 350,000 units. Then, Elon Musk wanted 100,000 GPUs for his own AI projects. In a single quarter in 2023, 500,000 units were sold, and the wait time was well over a year.
So you guys know when Zuck calls it H100, his data center of H100s, there's like, I think you're coming up on 600,000, and we're
good customers.
The race for AI completely depended on advanced, state-of-the-art chips made by Nvidia. And a frenzy of investment in these AI chips catapulted Nvidia's market cap to over $1 trillion in 2023, putting it in an elite club with companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook. According to some, Nvidia's success with AI came down to extraordinary luck. But there was a dramatic difference between Nvidia stumbling into the crypto mining boom and its strategic placement associated with the rise of AI. After learning that Nvidia's GPUs had been used for some of the most impressive deep learning research back in 2012, Jensen started pivoting all of his resources, a $7 billion company at the time, right towards artificial intelligence. He estimates between then and 2022, Nvidia pumped more than $30 billion into these high-end AI-enabled chips, a full decade before the technology had caught up to him.
Fortunately, we realized the potential of deep learning as a whole new software approach and turned every aspect of our company to advance this new field. We risked everything to pursue deep learning. A decade later, the AI revolution started, and Nvidia is the engine of AI developers worldwide.
And thanks to AI, Nvidia had grown so massive that Jensen spent $1 billion on a 750,000 square foot, spaceship-sized headquarters in Santa Clara, California. From there, Jensen was steering a Titanic-sized company deeper into the sea of AI. But this level of success brought even bigger problems for Nvidia, and there were stormy waters ahead, because Jensen would now find himself having to tiptoe a treacherous tightrope between two entities more powerful than any business on the planet: pushing the fine line between global business expansion and treason. In 2024, Nvidia's market cap broke a shocking $3 trillion. That's more than the economies of the Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, and Switzerland combined. But Nvidia's entire survival revolves around one tiny country, a 13,000 square mile island in East Asia, Taiwan. And for the last few decades, over 90% of the most valuable chips in the world have been manufactured by a single business, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC for short, just a 2.5-hour drive north of where Jensen Huang was born. TSMC's founder, Morris Chang, saw the opportunity to take away chip manufacturing from American companies like Intel and Texas Instruments going all the way back to the 1980s. And in doing so, he opened the doors for a company like Nvidia to do a process known as fabless manufacturing, where Jensen's teams would design and develop a computer chip's prototype so that TSMC could build them in mass quantities overseas, making it much cheaper to create startup chip companies and develop new advancements than ever before. Jensen has acknowledged that without TSMC, Nvidia would not be possible. So those epic tech battles against Intel and then later on against AMD would not have been won without the help of this Taiwanese manufacturer. And to this day, Nvidia still doesn't build any of its GPUs on its own. All of that work still happens at TSMC's fabrication plants, which wouldn't be a problem except Taiwan Semiconductor has been dealing with a life or death threat throughout its entire existence. Because Taiwan's closest neighbor, China, has loomed over the island going all the way back to the Chinese Civil War that split the country in 1949. The winning side, which is now led by President Xi Jinping, took China, while the losing side retreated to Taiwan to set up its own government. In mainland China's eyes, Taiwan is part of the Chinese state and should be controlled by Beijing. Tensions around this sensitive topic have significantly escalated over the past few years. Like when Taiwanese people elected a pro-sovereign government, China immediately responded with a series of military exercises all around the island. Ballistic missiles were shot near Taiwan, and Chinese fighter jets flew into Taiwanese airspace unannounced from a nearby aircraft carrier. But even with all that geopolitical friction, there is one thing China can't touch: the semiconductor industry. And that's because China is TSMC's biggest customer. So the global economy, including the tech for the world's most advanced militaries, from submarines and drones to hypersonic missiles and nuclear weapons, all run on chips that were designed by Nvidia but made in Taiwan by TSMC. In fact, TSMC has become so important to Taiwan's political survival that it has even been nicknamed the Silicon Shield. But these dynamics are changing quickly. China has made no secret of its plans to become more self-sufficient in the semiconductor space. Its official policy of military-civil fusion means that any technology developed by a Chinese company is shared directly with its armed forces and government. And because so much of the world's military technology is dependent on a Taiwanese company that China thinks it's entitled to, the US sees the semiconductor industry as an issue of national security, with most US political leaders vowing to defend the small island if China ever tried to invade. And in 2022, the US took things one step further by rolling out harsh restrictions to slow down China's chip development, which put Nvidia directly in the crosshairs between the two most powerful countries in the world. Because any chip that uses American-made software or design now needs a license to be exported to China. And this regulation states that it doesn't matter whether or not that the tech is actually manufactured in the US, but any high-end GPUs over a certain level of performance are now banned from being sold to China. And while Jensen understood the rationale, he also knew that China accounted for roughly 25% of Nvidia's total revenue prior to this law being signed. So he was determined to push the limits and get as close as possible to the edge without directly breaking any federal regulation.
We have to defer all of the policy making to the administration. They understand that the balancing national security versus the prosperity of American technology all over the world.
So he instructed Nvidia engineers to throttle some of their existing products and released a new line of chips, all designed specifically just under the maximum allowed output so that they could be sold to China and still evade US regulation. But even worse than that, there are reports that Chinese universities, research labs, and even government bodies are still getting their hands on these banned Nvidia chips. So how is this happening? Well, it really comes down to two methods. The first way is through resellers who are using unreported orders and alleged inventory stockpiles even after the regulation has been signed. This method makes it extremely difficult to determine if the US laws are being broken, but as soon as those supplies run out, this matter should be much more clear over time. But the second way that Chinese firms are still getting access to Nvidia's chips are through its cloud computing partners. In this instance, Nvidia sells its advanced AI chips to cloud service providers like Amazon AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure Cloud, and many other cloud providers that rent Nvidia processing chips to its customers. And sometimes these include Chinese companies. It's been reported that this primarily occurs with Chinese companies operating outside of mainland China, which technically doesn't violate the US law due to a senseless oversight by legislators who failed to include cloud services and physical products under the same restrictions, which is basically like saying China cannot buy the product, but they can rent and use the same exact product as much as they want. But even smaller cloud providers are taking on increasingly more risks, now renting Nvidia's most advanced AI chips to Chinese facilities located even within China itself. So how is Nvidia and Jensen to blame for all of this? Well, in the war for AI, Nvidia is the world's biggest arms dealer. Ultimately, Jensen controls the supply of these advanced GPUs, and with the demand for these chips so high, even the largest and most powerful tech companies in the world are facing significant wait times to get them, which means he has all the leverage in the world to impose contract restrictions on his clients or even ban sales to any company that bypasses the government regulation, which could effectively block all current routes providing Nvidia resources to China. That is, if that's what Jensen actually wanted. But with Jensen as its leader, Nvidia has proven time and time again that it's very comfortable sidestepping the law here or there if it advances Jensen's vision forward. But Jensen doesn't expect a doomsday scenario between the world's largest two superpowers. Instead, for him, it's more or less like business as usual for Nvidia. What makes matters even more curious, though, is that Jensen does have a personal interest in this issue. He grew up in Taiwan, and it was his first home. In May 2024, when he arrived back in Taiwan for a conference, he was greeted like a rock star. People crowded around him every night to snap pictures, have books signed, and catch a sighting of their island's most famous export. The media called his popularity Jensanity, and the feeling is mutual.
Huang also said his company would always invest in Taiwan.
Always investing in Taiwan. This is one of our most important countries.
So from Jensen's perspective, China still needs Nvidia, but Nvidia doesn't need China. All of Chinese technology priorities, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, are all going to need Nvidia's hardware. Because ever since Nvidia released the world's first GPU in 1999, it's been paving the way for the next generation of computing time and time again. And that doesn't appear to be slowing down anytime soon. From a small startup on the brink of bankruptcy to becoming one of the most important business leaders in the entire world, Jensen has seen it all during Nvidia's 30-year journey. In fact, he's now the longest-serving CEO in the history of the tech industry. And even when the crypto boom brought about its greatest rival in AMD, Nvidia weathered the storm to stand alone as the king of advanced computing technology. Thanks in part to Jensen's masterful decade-long pivot to AI, Nvidia was once again ready to capitalize on a trend years before there was any practical use for it, which made the AI boom possible, transforming Nvidia into the largest company in the world and making Jensen one of the richest people on the planet. But Jensen doesn't wake up proud and confident. Instead, he wakes up worried, because if Nvidia slips, the other biggest players in tech, Microsoft, Google, and Apple, will all be there to take advantage. Even today, they are all focused on designing processing chips themselves in hopes to topple Nvidia's empire. For now, though, Jensen is still the undisputed king of computing, and his products control all of the tech and apps that you love most. So it appears that no matter what direction technology heads in the future, there seems to be one guaranteed winner: Nvidia. But as Jensen continues to delicately straddle the boundary between ambitious and realistic, empowering and demanding, and now, most dangerously, right in the middle of a standoff between the US and China, it might not be a tech company that ends up taking his crown, but a real-life war. So then the big question for the most powerful tech executive on the planet becomes, where does his allegiance truly lie? To Nvidia, America, Taiwan, or to himself?